The individual recognized throughout history as Niccolò Machiavelli first saw the light of day on the 3rd of May, 1469 in Florence, situated in the heart of Italy. Niccolò's progenitor was Bernardo Machiavelli, an individual who had dedicated himself to the study of law and had established himself as a prominent legal mind of his era, harboring a profound appreciation for both classical literature and philosophy. Nevertheless, his family's involvement in political dissent against the Medici family's dominion, coupled with his own financial missteps leading to tax delinquency, hindered Bernardo's ability to practice law. Consequently, he faced economic hardship, relying on the income generated by his rural farm to sustain his livelihood. Bernardo's financial obligations posed a potential threat to the prospects of his young son Niccolò. Florentine legal statutes explicitly prohibited the sons of debtors from assuming public office, and by 1476, limitations were imposed on their inheritance rights to safeguard against the assumption of unpaid tax liabilities. Niccolò's mother, Bartolomea Machiavelli, had been nurtured within an affluent family where she benefited from an education typically withheld from young girls during that period. She initially wed the apothecary Niccolò Medici, bearing him a daughter. However, following her husband's demise in 1457, she entered into matrimony with Bernardo, with whom she had 4 offspring. Bartolomea demonstrated entrepreneurial initiative, engaging in business ventures despite societal constraints on women's economic. The nascent Machiavelli was born into a sizable residence situated near the southern banks of the Arno River, often referred to as the Palazzo Machiavelli. This dwelling was partitioned among 4 family branches, accommodating approximately 30 individuals in total. Despite these spatially restricted conditions, the Machiavelli lineage was an established and esteemed family in Florence, having amassed and preserved their wealth through careers in law, banking, and commerce. While Niccolò would indeed emulate his family by entering the professional echelons of Florentine society, it would be through his literary contributions that he would forge a legacy, becoming the most renowned and arguably infamous member of his lineage. Despite his family's esteemed standing and intellectual heritage, Niccolò Machiavelli's initial outlook appeared somewhat clouded, even as his city of birth, Florence, flourished as a prominent hub of artistic innovation and philosophical discourse during its golden age. During the medieval epoch, Florence stood as one of numerous independent city-states in northern Italy, ascending to become one of the wealthiest by the 15th century. Although certain republican customs persisted, Florentine politics were largely dictated by the affluent Medici family, who had accumulated their wealth through banking enterprises. The Medici did not occupy formal political positions. Instead, they leveraged their financial resources and influence to exert control over the city's political structures, including the Signoria. The Paramount Executive Council, composed of 9 members and presided over by the Gonfaloniere di Giustizia, or standard-bearer of justice. Under the Medici's sway, Florence evolved into the epicenter of the Italian Renaissance, a cultural and artistic resurgence propelled by a yearning to revitalize and expand upon classical antiquity. The crowning architectural achievement of the Renaissance in Florence was the octagonal cupola of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, conceived by Filippo Brunelleschi and finalized in 1436. In December 1469, coinciding with Machiavelli's birth year, the 20-year-old Lorenzo de' Medici succeeded his father as the city's de facto leader. Under his guidance, Florence would ascend to unprecedented splendor, earning him the epithet Lorenzo the Magnificent. Throughout the 15th century, mastery of Latin and Greek became increasingly vital for aspiring Florentine public servants. Bernardo Machiavelli, himself an admirer of classical antiquity, aspired for his son to receive a classical education. He believed this would pave the way for a career in law, state administration, or within the church hierarchy. Having learned to read between the ages of 4 and 6, Niccolò commenced his Latin studies at the age of 7. Despite his father's dedicated efforts, Niccolò's educational trajectory frequently encountered disruptions. Following a thwarted conspiracy against the Medici in 1478, conflict erupted between Florence and the Pope, who governed a substantial territory in central Italy. Bernardo, facing diminished income due to the war's impact on his farm situated south of the city, opted to economize by enrolling Niccolò to study under Benedetto Riccardini, who was already instructing a distant relative. In early 1479, the bubonic plague descended upon Florence, prompting Bernardo to relocate Niccolò to reside with relatives in the countryside, while he himself remained in the city. During the summer months, Bernardo contracted a severe case of the plague, but ultimately survived. This recovery allowed him to refocus on his son's continued education, and in January 1480, Niccolò was dispatched to study arithmetic under Piero Maria Caladri, a highly regarded educator. Following 2 years of arithmetic studies in November 1481, Bernardo Machiavelli entrusted Niccolò and his younger brother Toto to the tutelage of Paolo Sassi, a priest and instructor of grammar. Sassi imparted to Niccolò classical literature encompassing the works of celebrated authors such as Cicero, Virgil, and Livy. After mastering the reading and comprehension of their rhetorical and literary techniques, Niccolò was instructed in the art of translating letters from Italian into Latin, emulating Cicero's distinctive style. Given that this instruction was designed to groom students for professions in law or governmental service, the letters presented to Niccolò for translation were crafted to mirror realistic scenarios he might encounter in his future career. Concurrently, the classical texts he engaged with frequently incorporated discussions on morality and virtue, integral components of Florence's civic ethos. Subsequent to his tutelage under Sassi, Machiavelli enrolled in the university, likely between the ages of 16 and 18. There he attended lectures delivered by prominent scholars of the era, focusing on the most influential classical texts. Machiavelli began to harness the literary talents honed during his studies to cultivate favor with the Medici. Lorenzo the Magnificent passed away in 1492, leaving behind 3 sons, Piero, Giovanni, and Giuliano. Machiavelli composed several poetic verses in commendation of Giuliano. However, Lorenzo's eldest son and successor, Piero de' Medici, proved to be a politically inept leader. When King Charles VIII of France led his army into Italy in the summer of 1494, seeking to assert his claim to the Kingdom of Naples in southern Italy, Piero offered minimal resistance and consented to capitulate without consulting the Signoria. The incensed Florentines deposed Piero but struggled to establish a new governing structure, creating an opportunity for the priest Girolamo Savonarola. From his pulpit within the cathedral, the morally austere Savonarola condemned the opulence of the Medici and proclaimed the French invasion as divine retribution for the city's transgressions. Under his pervasive influence, luxurious items such as jewelry, paintings, poetry collections, and musical instruments were ritually incinerated in the infamous bonfires of the Vanities. Although the Machiavelli family had historically aligned with the opposition to the Medici, Niccolò's endeavors to ingratiate himself with them now risked backfiring. Concurrently, his mother Bartolomea had died in 1496, and his father Bernardo's income remained meager, plunging Niccolò and his brother Toto into severe financial straits. During this period, Machiavelli dedicated himself to translating the Andria, a play by the Roman satirist Terence, into his native Tuscan vernacular. Rather than producing a literal translation of the original Latin text, Machiavelli infused his rendition with his own earthy humor and subtle allusions, critical of Savonarola. Around this time, Machiavelli encountered Marcello Adriani, who had been appointed professor of poetry and rhetoric at the university in 1494. While Savonarola preached against the study of classical pagan Roman and Greek literature as sinful, Adriani championed the wisdom of the ancients as a compass for contemporary society. When Florence received assurances of its autonomy if Savonarola were silenced from preaching, his political adversaries mobilized against him. The Signoria found itself struggling to manage the ensuing political turmoil, further exacerbated by the passing of the long-serving chancellor, Bartolomeo Scala, which heightened existing tensions. The Florentines sought to identify a compromise candidate, someone unaligned with either Savonarola or the Medici factions. Machiavelli's absence of political affiliations now became an advantage. In February 1498, he put himself forward as a candidate for the office of Second Chancellor, a role responsible for managing the city's relations with subordinate towns and internal affairs. Though unsuccessful in this initial bid, his friend and mentor Marcello Adriani secured election to the first chancellorship. This was a challenging juncture for Florence, facing not only a constitutional crisis but also substantial debt incurred from ongoing warfare. Following the unexpected death of Charles VIII in April 1498, Florence launched a campaign to reclaim the port city of Pisa, which had rebelled against Florentine rule during the French invasion 4 years prior. Capitalizing on this situation, a Venetian army encroached upon Florentine territory from the northeast. including a detachment led by Piero de' Medici and his brothers. With the Venetians posing a threat to the city of Arezzo, the Florentine commander Paolo Vitelli was instructed to withdraw from Pisa and confront the Venetian incursion. Concurrently, the new French monarch Louis XV aimed to attack Milan and mend relations with both the Pope and Venice, potentially leaving Florence in a more isolated position. Florentine leaders now faced a critical decision: to maintain allegiance with France or to shift allegiances and unite with their Italian neighbors against France. Although Machiavelli, in his capacity as second chancellor, lacked formal diplomatic responsibilities, previous holders of the office had routinely engaged in diplomatic functions, occasionally even serving as ambassadors. In March 1499, Machiavelli was dispatched on a diplomatic mission to negotiate with a mercenary captain who was refusing to engage in combat. He effectively executed his directives, signaling Florence's resolve not to yield. Meanwhile, a peace overture from Venice in April proved unacceptable to both Florence and Pisa, indicating that the Venetians sought to disengage from the war and were now redirecting their attention towards potential conflicts with the Ottoman Empire to the east. This development emboldened the Florentines to renew their campaign against Pisa. Machiavelli compiled a report summarizing the perspectives of Florence's generals, concluding that Pisa could only be captured through a direct military assault. However, he encountered less success in July when he returned without an agreement from negotiations with the formidable Caterina Sforza, the regent of Forli. Sforza, an ally of both Florence and Milan, was being compelled to choose between the two. When French forces entered Italy and launched an attack on Milan in late July, the Florentines were once again compelled to align themselves with France. The Florentine offensive against Pisa in August initially met with success, breaching the city walls. However, rather than capitalizing on this breakthrough, Vitelli hesitated and established camp beneath the walls, while a malaria outbreak weakened the Florentine forces, affording the Pisans an opportunity to regroup. The Signoria, incensed by this inaction, dispatched reinforcements to Vitelli to ensure the siege's completion, but the commander lifted the siege before their arrival. Upon receiving correspondence from Louis XV demonstrating Vitelli's communication with Milan, he was apprehended and brought back to Florence. Machiavelli, convinced of Vitelli's treachery, endorsed his execution on the 1st of October. Meanwhile, the Florentine army continued to struggle in Pisa, prompting the Signoria to solicit military aid from Louis. When 5,000 Swiss mercenaries arrived in the spring of 1500, they displayed reluctance to engage in combat. Machiavelli was tasked with persuading the Swiss to fight, but proved unable to avert a mutiny in July. During this mutiny, a contingent of mercenaries seized a Florentine commissioner as a hostage, threatening his life unless their demands for payment were met. When Florence refused to be intimidated and prepared for military action, the Swiss mercenaries relented and departed. However, with their withdrawal, the Florentine army was no longer positioned to sustain the siege of Pisa. The siege's failure precipitated a deterioration in relations between Florence and its French ally, with each side attributing blame to the other for the setback. Machiavelli was among two envoys dispatched to France to present the Signoria's case that the Swiss mercenaries had conspired with the Pisans, and Florence would not remit further payments to the mutinous soldiers. The Florentine envoys encountered difficulties in substantiating their claims during a series of meetings in August and September with the king and his advisor, Cardinal Georges d'Amboise. The French representatives remained adamant that the Signoria had to remit the 38,000 francs still owed to the king. However, lacking the authority to concede to these demands, Machiavelli could only correspond with the Signoria, requesting further instructions and urging the appointment of a permanent ambassador to France. Although the Signoria acknowledged that paying Louis and preserving the French alliance was unavoidable, the city was already experiencing financial constraints and was disinclined to dispatch an ambassador. Despite the failure of the Arnaud diversion project, Machiavelli's involvement with such a bold engineering endeavor marked a turning point in his career. He had not only been entrusted with sensitive diplomatic missions, but now with large-scale strategic infrastructure, showing the degree of confidence the Florentine government had in his abilities. Though the project did not succeed, it demonstrated the innovative spirit of the Florentine Republic in facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. In the aftermath of the project's failure, the political atmosphere in Florence grew increasingly tense. Pisa remained defiant, supported by the Kingdom of Aragon and shielded from siege by its access to the sea. Meanwhile, Spanish influence continued to expand in the south, and Florence feared the encroaching dominance of Aragonese power throughout the Italian peninsula. Once again, Florence found itself squeezed between larger, more aggressive states with shifting alliances and uncertain loyalties. By the winter of 1504, Florence's hopes rested on France. Machiavelli was frequently consulted about diplomatic strategy, advocating for tighter coordination with the French court and urging a more assertive approach to Florence's military and diplomatic posture. He increasingly voiced concerns about the city's reliance on foreign mercenaries, whose loyalties were easily purchased by rival powers. Drawing upon his growing experience and observations, Machiavelli began outlining his vision for a citizen army, a force loyal to Florence and capable of protecting its interests without the unpredictable cost of mercenary betrayal. That vision began to take shape in March 1505, when the Signoria formally charged Machiavelli with overseeing the formation of a native militia. The decision marked a major shift in Florentine military policy, inspired largely by Machiavelli's warnings and proposals. His plan aimed to create a citizen force rooted in civic duty and loyalty to the Republic, emphasizing training, discipline, and moral strength. He believed that only through the involvement of ordinary citizens could Florence safeguard its liberty and restore its republican ideals. Machiavelli began organizing local recruitment efforts across the Florentine dominion, especially in rural areas where peasant populations were less politically volatile and more likely to commit to military training. The response was mixed. Some towns welcomed the initiative as a source of stability and prestige, while others resisted the imposition of military obligations. Nonetheless, Machiavelli pressed forward, writing detailed regulations for the militia, including standards for arms, conduct, and readiness. By 1506, the first companies of the Florentine militia were undergoing training, and Machiavelli proudly reported on their progress to Piero Soderini. In his letters and reports, he frequently emphasized the historical precedent of Roman citizen soldiers and the dangers posed by the corruption of mercenary forces. These ideas would later form the philosophical foundation of his military treatises and ultimately, The Prince. Even as Machiavelli worked to bring the militia to life, Florence remained caught in the greater web of Italian and European politics. Pope Julius II, once seen as a potential ally, had become increasingly antagonistic toward Florence. His ambitions to strengthen papal authority in central Italy led to a campaign to assert direct control over cities like Bologna and Perugia. The Pope's consolidation of power in the Romagna, once Borgia's domain, represented a significant threat to Florence, especially as Julius allied with Venice and began mobilizing troops near Florentine borders. Machiavelli, ever the keen observer, recognized the shifting dynamics and advised caution. In private correspondence, he remarked on the Pope's ruthlessness and strategic cunning, likening him to Borgia in ambition, but more adept in diplomacy. His reports from Rome and the Papal States increasingly took on a tone of warning, urging the Florentines to prepare for potential conflict. The growing tension with the papacy came to a head in 1508 when Florence's refusal to fully support Julius in his war against Venice resulted in increased diplomatic isolation. The following year, the Pope joined the League of Cambrai, an anti-Venetian alliance that included France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. The League's temporary alignment of these great powers alarmed the Florentines, who saw in it the seeds of a larger realignment that could easily sweep Florence into conflict, especially if Julius decided to settle old scores. By 1510, with Florence's position growing more precarious and alliances shifting once again across Europe, Machiavelli began contemplating deeper questions about power, governance, and fortune. His experiences as a diplomat, military organizer, and political advisor provided him with a rich foundation of real-world lessons. These experiences would soon coalesce into the writing that would make him immortal. In 1512, the Holy League, formed by Julius II and including Spain and the Emperor, launched a campaign to drive the French out of Italy. Florence, who was still allied with France, was caught on the wrong side of history. In August, Spanish troops invaded Tuscany and began pressing toward Florence. The citizen militia, still in its infancy, was unable to mount effective resistance, and by September, the Republic's position was untenable. On the 1st of September 1512, Spanish troops entered Florence, and within days, Soderini was forced to resign and flee the city. The Medici returned to power, backed by Spanish arms and popular support, from elite families hoping for stability and patronage. Machiavelli, who had served the Republic with tireless dedication, was dismissed from his post and soon after arrested on suspicion of conspiracy. Imprisoned and tortured, Machiavelli was released after several weeks but was barred from public office. He retired to his family estate outside Florence, bitter and disillusioned. It was there, in political exile, that he began to write, channeling his years of experience into reflections on leadership, war, power, and the fragile nature of liberty. Thus, from the ashes of Florence's Republican dream and his own fall from grace, Machiavelli began composing The Prince, not as a manual for tyranny, but as a distillation of everything he had witnessed in those turbulent years when Florence stood at the crossroads of history. However, Florence now found itself in need of external assistance, not only to reclaim Pisa, but also to safeguard its own territories. Cesare Borgia, the ambitious son of Pope Alexander VI, had already seized control of Forlì and Imola in the Romagna region, posing a direct threat to Florentine lands from the east. Louis XV, King of France, recognized the gravity of the situation and assured Machiavelli of French military support should Borgia dare to attack Florence or Bologna. The Signoria, Florence's governing council, demonstrated its commitment by pledging an immediate payment of 10,000 ducats. In December 1500, the newly appointed Florentine ambassador arrived in France, paving the way for Machiavelli's return to his native city. By May 1501, despite ongoing negotiations, Florence had yet to formalize an agreement with Louis XV. The precarious situation escalated when Borgia's forces crossed into Florentine territory. Desperate to secure French aid without further delay, the Signoria dispatched a substantial sum of 20,000 florins to the French king. Although Borgia offered assurances that Florence itself would not be targeted, his true intentions were revealed when he attempted to blackmail the Florentines. He demanded to be appointed captain general with a staggering annual salary of 36,000 florins, while simultaneously insisting upon the restoration of the exiled Medici family to power. The Signoria, incensed by Borgia's audacious demands, found itself in a precarious position. With Borgia's army of 10,000 men looming menacingly at their doorstep, they reluctantly agreed to negotiate. While Borgia eventually relented on his demands for regime change, he did secure the coveted title of Captain General, albeit with Florence lacking the financial capacity to meet his exorbitant salary expectations. However, in May, Machiavelli received reassuring news. Louis XV had ordered Borgia to immediately withdraw from Florentine territory. On May 26, Florence rejoiced at the news that 30,000 French troops were en route to Naples, their path leading them directly through Tuscany. In early June, the imposing French army approached Florence, compelling Borgia to retreat without receiving a single penny from the city. For much of 1501, Machiavelli dedicated his efforts to resolving the factional strife that had erupted in Pistoia, a nearby city under Florentine jurisdiction. Despite Machiavelli and his fellow Florentine representatives' persistent efforts, progress remained elusive for most of the year. By late August, however, both warring factions in Pistoia had initiated peace negotiations, notably excluding Florence from the process. The Signoria, apprehensive that these factions might unite against Florentine authority, dispatched Machiavelli to Pistoia in October to gather intelligence and assess the volatile situation. Within days, factional violence reignited in Pistoia. On October 18th, Machiavelli's role was elevated to Assistant Commissioner General, granting him broader authority to enforce the peace agreement while safeguarding Florence's dominion over Pistoia. Through Machiavelli's astute diplomacy and unwavering resolve, peace was restored to Pistoia by October 20th, significantly bolstering Florence's political and military standing in the region. Amidst the demands of his political career, August 1501 marked a personal milestone for the 32-year-old Machiavelli as he married Marietta Corsini, a woman of 20 years hailing from a family of considerably greater wealth than his own. While the marriage was likely arranged, it blossomed into a successful and affectionate partnership. Marietta frequently oversaw her husband's properties during his extended absences on government missions. Despite these successes, Florence remained far from secure. Following his role in King Louis XV's conquest of Naples, Cesare Borgia shifted his focus northward, intent on expanding his newly established Duchy of Romagna. He renewed his demands that Florence honor the agreement signed under duress in May. Rumors circulated that Giuliano de' Medici had offered France a substantial sum of 70,000 florins in exchange for French support in restoring Medici rule in Florence. These rumors deeply alarmed the Signoria. In April 1502, the Florentine government reluctantly agreed to pay Louis XIII a staggering 150,000 ducats to secure a promise of continued French protection. Emboldened by this renewed French alliance, the Florentines intensified their efforts to reclaim Pisa. However, their aspirations were dealt a severe blow when news arrived that Arezzo, another city under Florentine control, had been captured by Vitellozzo Vitelli, the brother of the mercenary captain whose execution Machiavelli had sanctioned years earlier. Adding to Florence's woes, Piero de' Medici arrived in Arezzo in June, receiving a rapturous welcome from the city's populace. Fearing a Medici resurgence, the Signoria dispatched Machiavelli to join Francesco Soderini in urgent negotiations with Cesare Borgia himself. Negotiations with Borgia commenced in Urbino in late June, initially proving unproductive. The Duke of Romagna, leveraging Florence's precarious political and military position, threatened to reinstate the Medici. He dismissed the notion that Louis XV would intervene to protect Florence. However, in early July, Louis XV demonstrably countered Borgia's assertions by leading a French army into Italy, explicitly declaring his intent to defend Florence against Borgia's aggression. Despite Borgia's desperate attempts to moderate his demands, the Florentines, bolstered by the tangible evidence of French support, felt sufficiently confident to break off negotiations altogether. While Florence successfully outmaneuvered Borgia on this occasion, primarily due to French intervention, Machiavelli cautioned his superiors against underestimating the Duke of Romagna's cunning and ambition. The crisis in Arezzo spurred the Florentines to undertake constitutional reforms aimed at enhancing political stability and continuity. The office of Gonfaloniere di Giustizia, Florence's most prominent political figure, had been characterized by its short two-month term, mirroring the limited tenure of other Signoria members. In late August, the Great Council, Florence's legislative body, approved the establishment of a Gonfaloniere for life. They subsequently appointed Piero Soderini, a seasoned diplomat, to this newly empowered office. Soderini's appointment was viewed favorably by Machiavelli, as Soderini's brother, Francesco, was a political ally whom Machiavelli had befriended during their joint mission to Borgia. Meanwhile, Borgia had traveled to Milan to mend his strained relationship with King Louis XV. He skillfully shifted blame for the recent outrages against Florence onto Vitelli and his fellow mercenary captains. By early 1502, Borgia had regained Louis XIII's favor, even securing the king's tacit approval for an attack on Bologna, a city under French protection. Machiavelli found Borgia receptive to striking a deal. The Duke of Romagna expressed a willingness to assist Florence in recovering Pisa and Arezzo. However, the Florentines, wary of jeopardizing their French alliance, stipulated that any agreement required Louis XIII's prior consent. As negotiations dragged on, Borgia's bargaining position grew stronger. The rebellious mercenaries and their Bolognese allies proposed a shift in strategy. Instead of attacking Bologna, Borgia should turn his formidable forces against Florence. Machiavelli, acutely aware of the shifting dynamics, dispatched urgent messages to Florence, advising his political superiors to finalize a deal with Borgia without delay. However, by the time Florence granted him the necessary authority in late October, Borgia had already entered into advanced negotiations with the mercenaries in Bologna, rendering Florence's overtures less appealing. Although a formal agreement between Borgia, the mercenaries, and Bologna was not concluded until early December, Machiavelli recognized that Florence had squandered a crucial opportunity. He requested permission to return home, but his request was denied. Instead, he was instructed to shadow Borgia's military campaign. On December 10th, Machiavelli followed Borgia as he departed Imola to meet with the mercenary captains he had re-enlisted into his service. While relieved that Borgia had seemingly abandoned plans to attack Florentine territory, Machiavelli remained apprehensive that the volatile Duke of Romagna might. Upon his return, Gonfaloniere Soderini immediately tasked Machiavelli with drafting a persuasive speech aimed at convincing the Florentine populace to accept new taxes. These taxes were intended to finance a significant increase in military expenditure. Machiavelli, employing his characteristic eloquence, argued that Florence needed to bolster its military strength to negotiate more effectively with powerful figures like King Louis XIV and Cesare Borgia. He emphasized that past experiences had demonstrated the rapid shifts in political tides. underscoring the city's imperative to prepare for all potential threats. When Soderini delivered Machiavelli's compelling speech on March 28th, it was met with widespread approval, solidifying Machiavelli's position as a trusted advisor to the Gonfaloniere. In April 1503, relations between France and the Borgias reached a breaking point, making armed conflict appear inevitable. Pope Alexander VI, sensing an opportunity to curtail French influence, initiated the formation of an anti-French league. He extended an invitation to Florence to join, offering papal recognition of the border between Florence and the Duchy of Romagna as an inducement. However, Florence, deeply reliant on its French alliance, remained hesitant to abandon Louis XIII, particularly with the imminent arrival of a French army in Tuscany. Having observed Cesare Borgia's capabilities firsthand, Machiavelli cautioned his superiors against underestimating him. In August, he penned a detailed report analyzing Borgia's masterful handling of the mercenary captain's rebellion and his cunning strategy to ensnare Vitelli and his associates. Around the same time, Machiavelli prepared another report, advising the Signoria on how Florence should respond should Arezzo, still simmering with resentment, rise up again and align itself with Borgia's cause. Drawing upon lessons from Roman history, Machiavelli argued that rebellious cities should be dealt with decisively, either through magnanimity or severe punishment, and that Florence's prior policy of moderation had proven ineffective. While Machiavelli advocated for a preemptive strike against Arezzo to deter any potential uprising, his superiors, more cautious, feared that such aggressive action might inadvertently push Arezzo's citizens into Borgia's camp. The arrival of a French army, marching southward towards Naples, temporarily diverted Borgia's attention away from Florence. However, the French forces were unable to spare any reinforcements to bolster Florence's defenses. On August 18th, Pope Alexander VI died unexpectedly, possibly succumbing to poisoning during a dinner with one of his cardinals. Cesare Borgia, who had also fallen ill at the same dinner, hastily made his way to Rome, seeking to influence the election of a new pope who would safeguard his interests. He initially received confirmation in his offices from the newly elected Pope Pius III. However, upon his arrival in Rome, his adversaries took to the streets, forcing him to seek refuge in the Castel San Angelo, a formidable papal fortress. When the elderly Pope Pius III died on October 18th after a reign of less than a month, Borgia threw his support behind the candidacy of Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, who had promised to confirm Borgia as Captain General of the Church in exchange for his backing. Machiavelli was dispatched to Rome on October 31st to observe the pivotal papal conclave. To Florence's relief, della Rovere was elected unanimously, assuming the papal name Julius II. While Florence welcomed this outcome, Machiavelli remained circumspect, recognizing that the new pope might not be able to fulfill all the promises he had made to secure his election. In November, Venetian troops captured Imola, threatening to seize control of the entire Romagna region, Borgia's former dominion. Amidst this escalating crisis, Machiavelli received assurances of papal support should the Venetians turn their aggression towards Florence. Meanwhile, Borgia, enraged by the Venetian occupation of his duchy, began to exhibit erratic behavior, increasingly distrustful of the Pope's commitment to honoring his pledges. In late November, Pope Julius II ordered Borgia's arrest. By early 1504, Cesare Borgia, once a formidable power broker, found himself imprisoned in Spain, his political fortunes dramatically reversed. Despite the mounting external pressures, Florentine morale remained high. When Michelangelo's awe-inspiring sculpture of David was completed and ceremoniously moved to the Piazza della Signoria on May 14th, the Florentines embraced it as a potent symbol of their defiance against a more powerful foe. Recognizing the urgent need to capture Pisa before Aragonese reinforcements could arrive in force, the Florentines devised an ambitious plan to construct two canals. These canals were intended to divert the flow of the Arno River, effectively drying up Pisa's port and cutting off its vital sea-based supply lines. Machiavelli was entrusted with the daunting task of supervising this complex engineering undertaking. However, as the project progressed, Machiavelli began to harbor doubts about the feasibility of the original plans. He proposed an alternative approach inspired by designs put forth by the renowned Leonardo da Vinci. Ultimately, however, by the end of September, the ambitious canal project was abandoned, marking a setback in Florence's ongoing struggle to reclaim Pisa and secure its regional dominance. Piero Soderini, the gonfaloniere, had been a fervent advocate of the Arno Canal scheme, and its abject failure significantly weakened his political standing. Machiavelli, ever loyal, dedicated the early months of 1505 to bolstering Soderini's authority. However, the specter of a Medici restoration loomed large, particularly if Florence were to suffer defeat at the hands of the Aragonese army. On August 17, 1505, the Florentine and Aragonese forces clashed in a pivotal battle. The Aragonese invasion force, numbering 3,000 men under the command of Bartolomeo d'Alviano, met the Florentine army in a fiercely contested engagement. Despite being evenly matched in terms of numbers, the Florentines, after hours of brutal fighting, emerged victorious. This triumph emboldened Soderini and the Florentine government to launch another campaign against Pisa. Machiavelli played a central role in the campaign's preparations. While the campaign commenced auspiciously, making the capture of Pisa seem imminent, internal discord among the Florentine commanders fatally undermined the assault. By mid-September, with the arrival of additional Spanish reinforcements, the Florentine army was forced to withdraw. This military setback once again cast doubt on Soderini's leadership. The Great Council, reflecting public disillusionment, refused to authorize further taxes to fund the faltering war effort. Facing a critical manpower shortage, Soderini acquiesced to Machiavelli's proposal to revive the citizen militia. Machiavelli enthusiastically embarked on recruiting men from the Tuscan countryside. On February 15, 1506, a contingent of 400 new recruits paraded through Florence, marking a tangible success for Machiavelli's efforts in recruitment and training. Despite the militia not yet receiving official sanction from the Great Council, Machiavelli garnered widespread praise for his initiative. In the summer of 1506, Pope Julius II, determined to reassert papal authority in the Romagna region, sought Florence's assistance for his campaign. Machiavelli was dispatched to Rome to negotiate the terms of Florentine support with the Pope. However, Julius, impatient for action, commenced his campaign without waiting for the Florentine troops. Between September and late October, Machiavelli accompanied the Pope on his northward march. Julius's campaign proved successful, culminating in the capture of Perugia and the ousting of its lord, Giampaolo Baglioni, a mercenary captain who had previously served Florence before switching allegiances. Florence welcomed the papal army's triumph in Perugia and eventually dispatched the requested contingent to assist Julius in the invasion of Bologna, which fell to papal forces on November 1st. Machiavelli returned to Florence deeply impressed by Pope Julius II's audaciousness and decisive leadership in battle, qualities that earned the pontiff the moniker Warrior Pope. Inspired by Julius II's boldness, Machiavelli sought to instill the same spirit in Florence. He dedicated the remainder of 1506 to championing his militia concept, which had by now grown to 5,000 men. On December 6th, the Great Council passed the bill drafted by Machiavelli, officially recognizing the citizen militia and appointing him to oversee its operations. Machiavelli devoted the early months of 1507 to organizing and training the militia. Despite his lack of prior military experience, he proved to be a remarkably effective organizer. Within weeks, small militia detachments were already conducting raids into the Pisan countryside, disrupting Pisan agriculture and supply lines. Meanwhile, Florentine diplomatic efforts to secure assistance from France or Aragon in their protracted war with Pisa remained fruitless. As rumors circulated of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian preparing for another Italian campaign, Florence cautiously considered seeking his support. In December 1507, Machiavelli was dispatched to assist the Florentine ambassador, Francesco Vettori, in negotiations with the emperor. However, it was not until January that Machiavelli reached the imperial court in Bolzano, located in the Tyrol region. Vettori's inexperience, compounded by communication challenges with Florence, hampered the negotiations. The emperor demanded a substantial sum of money that Florence was unwilling to pay, while Florence sought military assistance against Pisa, which Maximilian was disinclined to provide. Unexpectedly, Emperor Maximilian declared war on Venice, surprising many observers. While the initial stages of the imperial campaign were promising, Maximilian's armies ultimately suffered defeat. In June 1508, Maximilian signed a truce with Venice and withdrew his forces from Italy, rendering him incapable of either aiding or hindering Florence. Machiavelli returned home in June, relieved that Florence had averted a potentially costly and ill-advised alliance. In July, Machiavelli redirected his focus to the militia. When Gonfaloniere Soderini successfully persuaded the Florentine councils to undertake another siege of Pisa, Machiavelli mobilized the militia, ordering it to raid the Pisan countryside and devastate the harvest, further isolating the city and weakening its resolve. As the militia lacked a designated commander at that time, Machiavelli personally led this force on its mission. By November, Pisa was facing severe shortages of essential supplies, its resilience waning. In December 1508, the anti-Venetian League of Cambrai was forged, uniting Emperor Maximilian, King Louis XV of France, King Ferdinand of Aragon, and Pope Julius II in a powerful alliance. Florence, recognizing the shifting geopolitical landscape, swiftly concluded agreements with France and Aragon, pledging to pay each power 50,000 florins in exchange for their support against Pisa. Over several weeks in early 1509, Machiavelli tirelessly moved between Florentine army camps, ensuring that the besieging forces were adequately supplied and logistically prepared for the final assault on Pisa. On May 20th, 1509, the Pisans, facing starvation and relentless pressure, offered to surrender. On June 8, 1509, Machiavelli proudly marched at the head of the Florentine militia as Florentine authorities formally took control of Pisa after a grueling 15-year war, a resounding victory for Florence and a personal triumph for Machiavelli's vision of a citizen army. The victory in Pisa significantly bolstered Gonfaloniere Soderini's political standing in Florence. However, beneath the surface of Florentine politics, a campaign to restore the Medici family to power was slowly gaining momentum, subtly undermining Soderini's authority. With the death of Piero de' Medici in 1503, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici had ascended to the head of the influential Medici family. Meanwhile, the League of Cambrai achieved notable victories against Venice in the spring of 1509. By summer, however, the Venetians mounted a spirited counteroffensive, complicating the League's objectives. As Louis XIV of France and Emperor Maximilian engaged in disputes over the division of spoils in northern Italy, Pope Julius II began to reconsider his participation in the alliance. Having achieved his territorial goals in the Romagna, the Pope grew increasingly wary of a dominant French presence in northern Italy, mirroring his long-standing concerns about Venetian expansionism. In February 1510, Pope Julius II entered into a treaty with Venice, a move that threatened to fracture the League of Cambrai and had dire implications for Florence, particularly given Julius II's growing affinity for the Medici cause. In June 1510, Machiavelli was dispatched to France with instructions to persuade King Louis XV to maintain his alliance with Emperor Maximilian and to avert an open rupture with the increasingly pro-Medici Pope. While Louis XV remained steadfast in his commitment to Maximilian, he insisted that Florence provide military support against the Pope, a proposition fraught with peril for Florence. Machiavelli, employing his diplomatic skills, skillfully convinced Louis XIV that it was in France's best interest for Florence to remain neutral in the escalating papal-French tensions, thereby avoiding further antagonizing the volatile Pope. Despite securing these reassurances from the French king, Machiavelli, upon his return to Florence in September, was immediately tasked with the less palatable duty of recruiting 500 cavalrymen for the militia, a precautionary measure should Florence be unwillingly drawn into a war against the Pope. During the winter of 1511, the military tide shifted in France's favor, affording Florence a brief respite from immediate external threats. However, in the summer of 1511, Louis XV, in a provocative move, announced his intention to convene a general council of the Church in Pisa. The council's audacious objective was to depose the Pope, a direct challenge to papal authority, in a move that further alienated Julius II. Despite Machiavelli's earnest efforts to dissuade Louis XIII, the French king remained resolute that the council would proceed as planned in Pisa, regardless of the potential consequences. On October 5, 1511, Pope Julius II retaliated by joining forces with Aragon and Venice in the Holy League, a formidable alliance explicitly directed against France. This dramatic realignment of European powers placed Florence, still allied with France, in a precarious and increasingly dangerous position. During this battle, Giovanni de' Medici, the papal legate to the army and a key figure in the Medici family, was captured by French forces. The Florentines, initially elated by this French victory, saw it as a decisive blow against the prospect of a Medici restoration. However, over the ensuing 3 months, the tide of war turned dramatically against France. The armies of the Holy League launched relentless attacks on multiple fronts, overwhelming the overstretched French forces. By July 1512, French forces were effectively expelled from Italy, leaving Florence exposed and vulnerable to the vengeful Holy League. Despite Gonfaloniere Soderini and Machiavelli's frantic efforts to mobilize the militia and defend Florence, the Papal Army's devastating campaign proved unstoppable. Facing imminent military defeat and internal political pressure, Gonfaloniere Soderini resigned at the end of August 1512. On September 1st, Giuliano de' Medici, accompanied by papal forces, re-entered Florence, marking the forceful Medici restoration. While the Holy League compelled the Signoria to formally accept the Medici return, Giuliano de' Medici's position remained fragile. Initially, he attempted to forge a broad consensus, seeking to reconcile with moderate factions and even some of Soderini's former supporters. Desperate to retain his hard-won political offices, Machiavelli, in a calculated move, began to lavish praise upon the Medici in his writings, hoping to ingratiate himself with the new regime. However, when the radical pro-Medici faction seized control of the Signoria, Machiavelli's carefully constructed overtures proved futile. On November 7, 1512, he was summarily dismissed from all his government positions, marking a devastating end to his 14 years of public service. Worse was yet to come. In February 1513, Machiavelli was arrested and imprisoned following the discovery of a conspiracy against the Medici, further solidifying his fall from grace. Following an investigation, Machiavelli was initially ordered to be released upon payment of a hefty fine of 1,000 florins. However, before he could raise this substantial sum, Pope Julius II died unexpectedly on February 21st. In a twist of fate, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, Machiavelli's former target of political maneuvering, was elected as the new pope, assuming the name Leo X. With the Medici firmly entrenched in power in Florence and Giovanni now elevated to the papacy, their dominance was unassailable. In a gesture of magnanimity or perhaps political expediency, Giuliano de' Medici declared a general amnesty, allowing Machiavelli to walk free from his prison cell on March 11, 1513. Upon his release, Machiavelli, still harboring aspirations for a return to Florentine public life, appealed to Giuliano de' Medici, as well as Pope Leo X, through his influential friends in Rome. These efforts to regain favor with the Medici proved unsuccessful, forcing Machiavelli to confront the reality of his political exile. He made the difficult decision to relocate his family to one of his rural properties situated in the countryside south of Florence, seeking solace and a semblance of normalcy away from the political turmoil of the city. While this rural retreat offered a welcome respite and opportunities for reflection, Machiavelli remained intellectually engaged in the affairs of state. He continued to serve as an informal source of advice and political analysis for his longtime friend, Francesco Vettori, who was then serving as Florentine ambassador in Rome. The two men engaged in extensive correspondence, dissecting the ever-shifting diplomatic landscape of Italy and Europe. They observed the Holy League, the very alliance that had brought down Soderini and the Republic, begin to unravel as Emperor Maximilian and the newly deceased Pope Julius II ironically turned against Venice, their erstwhile ally. Throughout these dramatic political and military shifts, Machiavelli diligently corresponded with Vettori, offering his astute observations and strategic insights on how the Pope, and by extension the Medici, should respond to these ever-evolving developments. Perhaps motivated by a lingering hope of regaining political favor and a return to public service, Machiavelli channeled his enforced leisure into literary pursuits. From his countryside retreat, he embarked on writing a short book, a work that would ultimately transcend the immediate political context of its creation and guarantee his enduring fame across centuries. The Prince. In The Prince, Machiavelli articulated a starkly realistic and often controversial vision of political rule, departing sharply from traditional moralistic and idealistic treatises on princely conduct. He meticulously crafted The Prince, hoping that the wisdom and pragmatic insights contained within its pages would serve as a compelling demonstration of his political acumen, ultimately leading to his re-employment by the Medici regime. Astutely avoiding any direct mention of the Medici by name, Machiavelli offered ostensibly general advice on how a prince who ascends to power through fortune or circumstance, rather than hereditary right, can effectively consolidate and maintain his rule over a realm fraught with internal and external challenges. In undertaking this project, Machiavelli consciously positioned himself within a well-established tradition of writers and intellectuals, offering guidance to rulers on the art and science of governance. Both classical philosophers and Christian theologians had long espoused the notion that virtue, in its various forms, constituted the surest foundation for a prince to secure and perpetuate his power. However, Machiavelli, in a radical departure from this prevailing conventional wisdom, resolutely rejected such idealistic notions. He argued, based on his keen observations of the tumultuous realities of Italian and European politics, that in the actual world of power and statecraft, princes who consistently attempted to adhere to virtuous principles invariably suffered at the hands of both external adversaries and internal rivals. Instead, Machiavelli posited a more pragmatic and arguably more cynical approach to governance. He contended that effective princes must cultivate and deploy qualities such as boldness, audacity, and even ruthlessness when necessary. He frequently cited Cesare Borgia, a figure both admired and reviled for his cunning and decisiveness, as a prime example of a ruler who, while not conventionally virtuous, had achieved remarkable political success through the pragmatic application of power. Machiavelli argued that a prince's primary motivations should be the pursuit of glory and honor, rather than adherence to abstract notions of virtue. Drawing upon his extensive experiences serving the Florentine government during years of relentless warfare and political intrigue, Machiavelli asserted that to effectively counter external threats and ensure the state's survival, a prince must cultivate and rely upon his own citizen militia, rather than depending on the inherently unreliable loyalty of mercenary forces or the shifting alliances of other powers. With respect to maintaining internal order and overcoming the factionalism that had plagued Florence and many other Italian city-states for decades, Machiavelli advanced the controversial argument that it was generally more advantageous for a prince to be feared than to be loved, if a clear choice between the two had to be made. This assertion, perhaps more than any other in The Prince, contributed to Machiavelli's enduring and often unflattering reputation as a political philosopher who seemingly justified the calculated use of morally questionable means to achieve political ends. Machiavelli fervently hoped to present a copy of The Prince to Giuliano de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence after the Medici restoration. However, Giuliano, often preoccupied with affairs in Rome, delegated much of the day-to-day governance of Florence to his nephew Lorenzo, Piero de' Medici's son. In January 1514, Machiavelli dispatched an early, still unfinished draft of The Prince to his friend Francesco Vettori, the Florentine ambassador in Rome, seeking Vettori's assessment and hoping Vettori might facilitate its presentation to Giuliano. Vettori, upon reading the manuscript, was immediately impressed by Machiavelli's incisive analysis and pragmatic approach. Over the following months, Machiavelli diligently refined The Prince, subtly inserting stronger hints that a wise and effective ruler would be well advised to employ experienced and capable public servants, individuals like himself in positions of influence. Beyond matters of state and political philosophy, Machiavelli and Vettori, in their extensive correspondence, also found time to exchange more personal and lighthearted stories, often revolving around their respective romantic and amorous pursuits. Although by this time Machiavelli was a married man with 3 children, and his wife Marietta was expecting their 4th child, he continued to indulge his passions, not only with women but also in a reflection of certain libertine practices inherited from classical antiquity and adopted by some men of the Renaissance elite with young boys. In June 1514, these diversions provided Machiavelli with some measure of consolation after Vettori informed him that the Medici, despite his literary efforts and Vettori's advocacy, remained unreceptive to his appeals for reemployment. Neither Machiavelli himself nor his groundbreaking treatise The Prince would be welcomed into the inner circles of Medici power in Rome or Florence, leaving his political future uncertain and his hopes for a return to public service seemingly dashed. While Machiavelli braced himself for a protracted period of political obscurity, a glimmer of hope emerged in December. Vettori, acting on behalf of Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, the Pope's cousin, reached out to Machiavelli, seeking his counsel on a critical matter: whether the Pope should forge an alliance with France or align himself with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Machiavelli, drawing upon his astute political analysis, advocated for a French alliance. He astutely predicted that King Louis XIV would ultimately prevail, irrespective of papal support. He cautioned, however, that if the Pope were to back the losing side, Louis might be tempted to depose him, creating a precarious situation for the papacy. The Pope initially opened to negotiations with France, ultimately joined the anti-French League, as Francis I proved unwilling to concede papal sovereignty over the strategically important cities of Parma, Reggio, Modena, and Piacenza. On September 13th, the French army, caught off guard by a Swiss force at Marignano, teetered on the brink of defeat. However, the timely arrival of their Venetian allies at the 11th hour turned the tide of battle, securing a French victory and enabling Francis I to recapture Milan a few weeks later. Capitalizing on his newfound position of strength, King Francis I signed a truce with the Pope, placing the Papal States in Florence under French protection in exchange for the cession of Parma and Piacenza. Earlier in July, Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, who had assumed command of the Florentine militia, had sought Machiavelli's expert advice. Before Machiavelli could dispatch his strategic recommendations, Lorenzo was unexpectedly appointed captain general of the papal army, replacing his ailing uncle, Giuliano de' Medici. In the aftermath of the accord between King Francis I and Pope Leo X, Machiavelli, sensing an opportunity to ingratiate himself with Lorenzo de' Medici, rededicated the prince to him in January 1516, hoping this gesture would pave the way for his return to political favor. However, when he presented his treatise at the Palazzo Medici, Lorenzo, preoccupied with a recent acquisition of hunting dogs, paid scant attention to Machiavelli's meticulously crafted work, leaving the author deeply disillusioned and resentful. Infuriated by Lorenzo's perceived indifference and lack of appreciation, Machiavelli vowed to sever all ties with the Medici, resigning himself to their eventual downfall. Accepting the demise of his political aspirations, Machiavelli joined a circle of Florentine intellectuals and writers who convened in the secluded Orti Orcellari Gardens, a haven for Republican-minded thinkers. It was within this intellectual milieu that Machiavelli embarked on, composing a lengthy allegorical poem entitled The Ass. Drawing inspiration from Homer's Odyssey, the poem's narrator recounts his experiences on the mythical island of Circe, the enchantress, where he encounters a menagerie of animals, each representing men transformed by Circe's sorcery. Through veiled allegorical digressions, Machiavelli's animal figures subtly satirize the Florentine political elite, while the narrator's transformation into an ass symbolizes the author's self-imposed withdrawal from his former life of political engagement. Despite Machiavelli's ostensible intent to retreat from political commentary, his literary output, regardless of genre, consistently lent itself to interpretations as critiques of Florentine politics and society. During this period of semi-retirement, he penned Mandragola, a 5-act comedy that masterfully satirizes Florentine morals and societal conventions. The play centers on Callimaco, a young Florentine nobleman who cunningly orchestrates a scheme to seduce Lucretia, a beautiful but childless married woman. Callimaco, shedding his physician's disguise, arranges to be kidnapped to fulfill this role. Even after Callimaco reveals his true identity to Lucrezia, she, captivated by his charm and audacity, proposes they become lovers. Lucretia's delighted husband, oblivious to the deception and grateful for Callimaco's supposed sacrifice, bestows upon him the keys to his house, granting him unfettered access. Mandragola, beyond its comedic brilliance and social satire, can also be interpreted as an allegory for Florence's perceived sterile union with the Medici regime. The play subtly suggests that any means, even deception and manipulation, are justified in the pursuit of restoring Florence's lost liberty and republican ideals. Machiavelli relished the intellectual camaraderie in stimulating discussions he shared with his companions at the Orti Orcellari. These exchanges spurred him to contemplate the underlying causes of Florentine society's perceived corruption. He concluded that Florence's moral and political decay stemmed from its failure to heed the lessons of classical antiquity, particularly the virtues and principles that had underpinned the Roman Republic's greatness. Inspired by this insight, Machiavelli embarked on a monumental literary project, Discourses on Titus Livius. Framed as a commentary on the Roman historian Livy's monumental History of Rome, Ab Urbe Condita, the Discourses evolved into a profound and systematic treatise on political philosophy, seeking to establish a comprehensive set of principles for the effective exercise of political power and the preservation of republican liberty. Conversely, he argued, as soon as cities and states succumbed to tyranny and autocratic rule, their fortunes inevitably began to decline. their civic virtue eroded, and their capacity for greatness diminished. For Machiavelli, liberty encompassed not merely freedom from external oppression or despotic rule, it also entailed the active participation of citizens in the political life of the Republic, the enjoyment of equal political rights, and, crucially, a collective willingness to prioritize the common good above narrow individual interests and factional rivalries. Echoing and expanding upon his earlier, more pragmatic ideas articulated in The Prince, Machiavelli's conception of civic duty in the discourses often prioritized the well-being and stability of the Republic above conventional moral considerations. He argued that to safeguard liberty and ensure the Republic's survival, states must actively strive to eliminate deep-seated class divisions, rigorously enforce the rule of law, cultivate a unifying state religion that fostered civic virtue, and, most importantly, be led by virtuous and capable men who embodied the ideals of republicanism. In the concluding passages of the discourses, Machiavelli lamented the perceived absence of such virtuous leadership in contemporary Florence, a city plagued by corruption and factionalism. However, even in his lament, he expressed a flicker of hope, yearning for the emergence of a transformative leader who could rekindle Florentine civic virtue, overcome political divisions, and restore the city to its former glory. Shortly after completing the discourses, Machiavelli unexpectedly found himself presented with a potential avenue for a return to public life. Lorenzo de' Medici, to whom he had so unsuccessfully dedicated The Prince, died prematurely at the young age of 26 in May 1519. In the wake of Lorenzo's death, Pope Leo X dispatched his cousin, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, to assume temporary governance of Florence. Cardinal Giulio, a more astute and politically pragmatic figure than his deceased cousin, recognized the need to bridge the deep factional divides within Florentine society. He initiated a series of constitutional reforms aimed at broadening political participation and fostering a more inclusive government. Machiavelli, sensing a shift in the political winds and perceiving an opportunity to regain favor and serve the new, more moderate Medici regime, once again turned to his pen in an attempt to secure public employment. Following the death of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I in January 1519, his grandson Charles V had been elected to succeed him, consolidating vast territories and power in his hands. Charles V was already the King of Spain, inheriting the Spanish throne upon the death of his maternal grandfather, King Ferdinand of Aragon, in 1516. From Ferdinand, Charles also inherited the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily in southern Italy, placing Florence and the Papal States in a precarious geopolitical position, threatened by Charles the Mavor's expanding imperial reach from both the north and south. In October 1519, Pope Leo X, having failed to reach a mutually agreeable understanding with King Francis I of France, entered into a strategic alliance with Charles V against the French. Florence, inextricably linked to papal policy, would inevitably be drawn into this looming conflict between the Habsburg and Valois dynasties. Recognizing the gravity of the impending war and seeking to demonstrate his renewed value to the Medici regime, Machiavelli, in November 1519, embarked on writing a treatise dedicated to military matters, hoping to impress Cardinal Giulio de' Medici with his strategic insights and expertise. In The Art of War, Machiavelli meticulously outlined his theories and practical recommendations concerning warfare, employing the persona of Fabrizio Colonna, a seasoned mercenary captain, as his mouthpiece. Echoing his central arguments in The Prince and Discourses, Machiavelli asserted that a robust and effective military force constituted the ultimate guarantor of a state's liberty and security. He reiterated his long-held conviction that a citizen militia, composed of loyal and patriotic citizens, was demonstrably superior to unreliable mercenary armies, whose primary allegiance lay with their paymasters rather than the states they served. In The Art of War, Machiavelli subtly sought to vindicate his own legacy as the architect and organizer of the Florentine militia under Soderini Republican government, implicitly arguing for the enduring relevance of his military vision. Beyond matters of military organization and training, The Art of War delves into extensive discussions of military technology, weaponry, and fortifications. Machiavelli, keenly aware of the evolving nature of warfare in the early 16th century, championed the adoption of the latest military innovations, including firearms and the newly developed star-shaped fortresses, which offered significantly enhanced protection against increasingly powerful artillery bombardments. Cardinal Giulio, impressed by Machiavelli's intellect and strategic insights, conveyed a favorable recommendation to Pope Leo X, paving the way for Machiavelli's long-sought political rehabilitation. Pope Leo X, swayed by his cousin's assessment, agreed to grant Machiavelli a second chance, offering him a path back into Florentine public life. In April 1520, Machiavelli received official notification that he would be commissioned to write a comprehensive history of the Florentine state, a prestigious and symbolically significant appointment that marked his official return from political exile. However, before formally awarding Machiavelli the coveted contract in November, the Medici, still exercising caution, requested that he undertake a series of minor diplomatic missions to demonstrate his renewed loyalty and prove his continued worthiness of their trust. Machiavelli acquitted himself admirably in these diplomatic assignments, diligently serving the Medici regime and exceeding their expectations. Impressed by his competence and political acumen, Cardinal Giulio, in addition to his historical commission, requested that Machiavelli prepare detailed proposals for constitutional reform in Florence. In his comprehensive report, Machiavelli meticulously analyzed the various governmental structures and political transitions Florence had experienced over the preceding century. Drawing upon his historical analysis and political philosophy, he astutely argued that Florence, with its long-standing republican traditions and civic culture, was fundamentally best suited to a republican form of government, rather than autocratic Medici rule. Acknowledging the inherent tension between his republican recommendations and the Medici's entrenched authority, Machiavelli cleverly proposed a series of constitutional compromises. He suggested abolishing the Signoria, the historically Republican Executive Council, and replacing it with a body of 65 men to be appointed directly by the Pope. Finally, in a nod to Florence's Republican past, Machiavelli proposed reviving the Great Council, the historically popular assembly that had represented the broader citizenry. However, recognizing the Medici's deep-seated aversion to genuine popular sovereignty, Machiavelli subtly curtailed the Great Council's powers, suggesting that its primary function would be to ratify decisions made by the Pope, the Cardinal, and the more elite councils. Crucially and perhaps strategically, Machiavelli proposed that ultimate authority over the judicial system and the Florentine militia, the two key instruments of state power, should be explicitly vested in the Pope and Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, effectively consolidating Medici control over these vital institutions, even within a nominally Republican framework. While Machiavelli's ambitious proposals for constitutional reform ultimately proved too radical and too overtly Republican for the Medici to fully embrace, they nonetheless solidified his renewed standing within the regime. He continued to enjoy the Medici's confidence and patronage, having successfully navigated his return from political exile. In January 1521, as Machiavelli diligently pursued his historical commission, war erupted anew between King Francis I of France and Emperor Charles of France, plunging Italy once again into the maelstrom of great power conflict. Pope Leo X, recognizing the shifting balance of power and the growing threat posed by France, formally entered into an alliance with Charles of France against the French. Charles of France, in exchange for papal and Florentine military support, pledged to wrest control of Milan from the French and to guarantee the Medici's continued rule in Florence, further entangling Florence in the larger European power struggle. Although Machiavelli, with his extensive diplomatic and military experience, might have reasonably hoped to play a more prominent political or diplomatic role during this latest round of hostilities, his services were instead directed toward a more mundane, albeit symbolically significant task. He was asked to resolve a long-standing dispute involving the Franciscan order, leveraging his diplomatic skills to secure a resolution favorable to Florence, invoking the authority of Pope Leo VI to mediate the complex ecclesiastical matter. Meanwhile, the fate of Italy hung precariously in the balance as the French and papal imperial armies prepared for a decisive military confrontation. Machiavelli, ever the pragmatist, seized this opportune moment to publish The Art of War, disseminating copies of his treatise to the leading military and political figures of the day. Having seemingly relinquished his personal political ambitions, Machiavelli's primary motivation in publishing The Art of War at this critical juncture was to disseminate his military theories and strategic insights, hoping to encourage best practices and enhance the effectiveness of the papal imperial army as it prepared for war against France. By the end of 1521, the French military campaign in Italy began to unravel, plagued by logistical difficulties, internal dissensions, and the relentless pressure of the papal imperial forces. On November 20th, the city of Milan, long a contested prize in the Franco-Habsburg rivalry, rose in rebellion against French rule, compelling the French army to withdraw from Italy, marking a significant victory for the imperial-papal alliance and further solidifying Charles I's dominance in the Italian peninsula. During the winter of 1521, Machiavelli resumed his historical labors, diligently working on his commissioned history of Florence. However, Florence was once again plunged into political uncertainty and instability by the unexpected death of Pope Leo X on December 1st. The Pope's demise significantly weakened the Medici's grip on power in Florence, creating a political vacuum and emboldening their Florentine rivals. Cardinal Francesco Soderini, long exiled from Florence and eager to restore his family's influence, saw an opportunity to capitalize on the Medici's vulnerability. With the promise of covert French support, Cardinal Soderini began plotting to expel the Medici from Florence and reinstate his brother, Piero Soderini, the former Gonfaloniere, to power, rekindling the long-standing factional rivalries that had plagued Florentine politics for decades. Even though Machiavelli had once been closely aligned with the Soderini family, forging friendships and political alliances with them during his years in public service, he remained steadfastly loyal to the Medici, viewing them as the only viable force capable of maintaining stability and order in Florence. In the midst of this renewed political turmoil, Machiavelli, ever the pragmatist, proposed a revised set of constitutional reforms, subtly modified from his earlier proposals, yet still reflecting his enduring belief in the necessity of a mixed constitution that balanced elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and popular participation. These revised proposals, presented to Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, were intended to navigate the delicate political landscape and preserve Medici authority while accommodating some degree of broader political representation. The rapidly changing political landscape, characterized by renewed factionalism and the looming threat of renewed conflict, prompted Cardinal Giulio de' Medici to cautiously accept Machiavelli's recommendations for constitutional reform, recognizing the need for political pragmatism and compromise to maintain Medici control. However, before these reforms could be fully implemented, the Soderini plot to assassinate Cardinal Giulio and seize control of Florence was uncovered and decisively thwarted in April 1522, further consolidating Medici power and eliminating a key source of opposition. The Medici hold on power in Florence was now more secure than ever, particularly after Piero Soderini, the figurehead of the anti-Medici conspiracy, died a few weeks after the failed coup attempt, effectively decapitating the Republican opposition. Machiavelli, despite his political pragmatism and shifting allegiances, mourned the death of his old friend Piero Soderini, as well as the exile of many of his younger intellectual companions from the Orti Orcellari circle, who had actively supported the ill-fated anti-Medici plot, further diminishing the vibrant Republican intellectual community that had briefly flourished in Florence. Machiavelli's personal spirits were further dampened by the death of his younger brother Toto in June, adding personal grief to his professional and political disappointments. On September 14, 1523, Pope Leo X's successor, Adrian VI, died after a brief pontificate. In a momentous development for Florence and the Medici family, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici was elected as the new pope, assuming the papal name Clement VII, elevating Medici power to unprecedented heights. Although the new pope, Clement VII, had initially aligned himself with Emperor Charles V in the ongoing wars against King Francis I of France, both the papacy and Florence found themselves increasingly burdened by the immense financial costs of continued warfare. Despite the absence of direct papal support, the imperial armies under Charles I's command continued to press their military advantage, pushing the French forces across the Alps and effectively driving them out of Italy, further solidifying Habsburg dominance in the Italian peninsula. In 1524, Pope Clement VII, secure in his papal authority and turning his attention to Florentine affairs, dispatched his illegitimate cousins, Ippolito and Alessandro de' Medici, to jointly rule over Florence, establishing a more direct and firmly entrenched Medici dynasty in the city. While peace of a sort was restored to Florence under Medici rule, Machiavelli, perhaps seeking solace and distraction from his political disappointments and personal losses, embarked on a passionate affair with Barbara Salutati, a renowned Florentine actress and singer to whom he dedicated several heartfelt love poems, revealing a more romantic and less overtly political facet of his complex personality. Recognizing, perhaps with a touch of self-deprecating humor and a sense of guilt over his marital infidelities, that he was mistreating his wife, Machiavelli penned the comedic play Ecclesia, a farcical exploration of lust, deception, and marital folly. Ecclesia mockingly portrays a foolish married man who embarrasses himself in a ludicrous and ultimately futile attempt to pursue a young girl, thinly veiled autobiographical elements adding a layer of personal irony to the comedic narrative. Ecclesia premiered on January 13, 1525, and was met with instant popular acclaim, demonstrating Machiavelli's enduring literary talents beyond the realm of political treatises and historical chronicles. In March 1525, Machiavelli completed his magnum opus, Florentine Histories, a monumental historical work commissioned by the Medici, meticulously chronicling over 1,000. I will go through the text paragraph by paragraph and rephrase it according to these instructions. I will pay close attention to maintaining the original meaning and tone while using different wording and sentence structures. I will keep all proper names, Niccolò Machiavelli, Florence, Medici, etc., and dates unchanged. I will also make sure that numerical data like years and amounts remain accurate. The overall tone is informative and biographical, which I need to maintain. Just as with his political treatises, Machiavelli's historical account of Florence served not merely as a narration of past events, but it was intended to guide them in learning from the city's historical trajectory to maintain Florentine unity. He meticulously documented the seemingly endless cycle of partisan strife that repeatedly led to governmental upheaval. Machiavelli critiqued the common tendency of each faction, upon seizing power, to exclude their political adversaries entirely. By implicitly commenting on the Medici family's inclination towards autocratic governance, Machiavelli's history advised them to broaden governmental participation to be more inclusive. He urged them to strive for a balance among the interests of all political strata within Florentine society. He argued that by adopting such an approach, they would not only fortify the city against both internal divisions and external threats, but also pave the way for Florence to reclaim its lost liberty and former glory. As Machiavelli neared completion of his historical work, a pivotal military event unfolded. The imperial army achieved a decisive victory at Pavia on February 24th. During this battle, King Francis II of France was captured as a prisoner of war. This military catastrophe had dire repercussions for the Pope, who had been compelled to align himself with France in late 1524. During Pope Clement VII's subsequent negotiations with Emperor Charles V, the emperor made sweeping demands, insisting that Florence, Siena, and Lucca be brought under imperial dominion. These terms were deemed unacceptable by the Pope. Clement recognized that the only alternative to acquiescence was war, despite his palpable lack of military strength. When Machiavelli formally presented his completed history of Florence to the Pope in May, he also included a strategically timely proposal. He advocated for the establishment of a citizen militia in the Romagna region, designed to serve as a bulwark against the encroaching imperial army. Although Pope Clement VII initially endorsed the concept in principle, upon Machiavelli's arrival in the Romagna to implement the plan, he was promptly informed that the scheme was, in practical terms, unfeasible. In January 1526, France and Spain concluded a treaty. King Francis I, under duress, formally relinquished his claims to Milan and Naples. However, upon regaining his freedom from captivity, Francis promptly repudiated the treaty and began preparations for renewed hostilities. The Pope, understandably apprehensive that Emperor Charles V might advance on Rome, recognized that Florence stood directly in the path of any imperial advance. Machiavelli, ever the strategic analyst, assessed Florence's existing defenses and submitted a report recommending that the city walls be significantly reinforced to effectively withstand the onslaught of modern artillery. In April, Machiavelli was summoned to Rome, where he received a significant commission to take personal charge of bolstering Rome's own fortifications, reflecting the papacy's growing sense of vulnerability. On May the 22nd, the League of Cognac, an anti-imperial alliance, was officially formed, uniting the papacy, France, Venice, and Florence in a common front against Habsburg power. By the end of June, the League's combined armies, under the command of Francesco della Rovere, had positioned themselves on the outskirts of Milan, poised for military action. Throughout May and June, Machiavelli diligently oversaw the urgent repairs and enhancements to Florence's city walls, working to strengthen its defenses. However, by early July, his responsibilities shifted. He was dispatched to join the League's army in the field, transitioning from administrator to military advisor. While Della Rovere exhibited hesitation in launching a direct assault on Milan, strategic inertia set in. In September, unsettling news reached Machiavelli from Rome. The powerful Colonna family, traditional papal adversaries, had amassed a private army to challenge Pope Clement VII's authority. Thereafter, the overall situation deteriorated rapidly. An imperial army consisting of 16,000 battle-hardened German lanzknechts swept through northern Italy in November. Their southward trajectory suggested Tuscany and Florence itself were directly in their path. In February 1527, Machiavelli was urgently dispatched to the League's headquarters to ascertain whether its combined armies would be committed to the defense of Florence, a mission of critical importance for the city's survival. Upon his arrival, he discovered a disheartening reality. Della Rovere, the League's commander, proved unwilling to execute his orders, paralyzed by a bitter dispute with the Pope, undermining the League's unity and effectiveness. Although Pope Clement VII managed to broker a temporary truce with the advancing imperial army, this diplomatic reprieve proved illusory. The lanzknechts, chronically underpaid and notoriously undisciplined, refused to abide by the truce terms, launching a devastating offensive that defied the authority of their own commanders. Belatedly acknowledging the imminent peril, Pope Clement VII hastily renewed his alliances with France and Venice, conceding to Della Rovere's demands in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. In April, the relentless imperial troops reached Arezzo, poised to unleash their fury upon Florence. However, in a fateful strategic shift, they opted to march directly on Rome, drawn by the allure of plunder and the symbolic significance of the papal capital, rather than risk a potentially costly and protracted siege of Florence against Della Rovere's forces. On May 6, 1527, the imperial army infamously sacked Rome, unleashing a wave of violence and destruction upon the city. Less than 2 weeks later, on May 16th, the Medici regime in Florence collapsed. They were forcibly expelled from the city, and the Florentine Republic, after years of Medici dominance, was unexpectedly restored, marking a dramatic reversal of fortune. Upon Machiavelli's return to Florence, he greeted the Republic's restoration with open enthusiasm, harboring hopes of a return to public office and the resumption of his political career. However, his declining health, compounded by his long-standing association with the Medici regime, proved to be insurmountable obstacles. He was conspicuously overlooked in the distribution of new Republican offices, a bitter disappointment that further aggravated his already fragile health. On June 21, 1527, Niccolò Machiavelli died at the age of 58. He was later interred in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, finding his final resting place alongside luminaries such as the scientist Galileo Galilei and the artist Michelangelo, a testament to his enduring place in Florentine history, albeit more for his writings than his political career. Niccolò Machiavelli dedicated his entire adult life to the service of his native Florence, navigating a treacherous period marked by intense political instability and relentless warfare across the Italian peninsula. While his personal political inclinations leaned towards republicanism, and much of his career was spent serving the Florentine Republic, he demonstrated a pragmatic willingness to transcend partisan loyalties. His overarching goal was to promote the long-term stability and prosperity of Florence, regardless of the prevailing political winds or ruling faction. His extensive experience as a diplomat, constantly adapting to ever-shifting alliances and geopolitical realities, provided him with a uniquely insightful perspective on the often unvarnished nature of political and diplomatic affairs. These hard-won insights, distilled and codified in his influential political writings, have resonated and provoked debate for centuries after his death. Machiavelli's pragmatic advice to political actors, urging them to prioritize state interests and, when necessary, set aside conventional moral and ethical considerations in the pursuit of power and stability, has profoundly horrified both Christian moralists and liberal philosophers alike. This amoral, or perhaps even immoral, dimension of his political philosophy has cemented his enduring, though often negative, reputation. The Prince is frequently interpreted, often simplistically, as a cynical handbook for tyrants and dictators, while the term Machiavellianism has become deeply embedded in the English language, synonymous with manipulative, ruthless, and deceitful political behavior. However, despite his enduring fame as a political theorist and writer, Machiavelli was also a multifaceted literary figure. Throughout his distinguished career, he penned poetry and fiction, demonstrating a versatility that extended beyond the realm of political analysis. His comedic plays, in particular, were widely acclaimed and enjoyed considerable popularity during his lifetime, while his personal letters to friends reveal a man of considerable humor, wit, and intellectual vibrancy, offering a more nuanced and humanized portrait than the often caricatured image of the cold, calculating Machiavellian. What is your own assessment of Niccolò Machiavelli? Does he genuinely deserve his mainstream reputation as a cynical advocate of manipulative and deceitful political methods, a detached, amoral technician of power? Or was he, beneath the often shocking pragmatism of his political prescriptions, a man of fundamentally Republican principles whose sometimes controversial political remedies were ultimately intended to forge strong and stable states, capable of guaranteeing enduring prosperity and liberty for their citizens, even if through morally ambiguous means? We encourage you to share your perspectives in the comments section below. In the meantime, thank you for watching.